Welcome to the EXCELcast. My name is Mark Clegg. I'm the Director of Entrepreneurship and Career Services here at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. I'm here with concert violinist Rachel Barton Pine. Rachel, it's great to have you here at the University of Michigan.
Great to be here.
Thanks so much for coming. So, I mean, if I had introduced all of the things you do in your career, I would have been like composer, editor, musicologist, really publisher, running your own foundation. I mean, you do so many different things that we talk about in EXCEL as what we call the portfolio career. But you didn't really get into it, you know, I think as a kind of economic strategy, but really it was your own curiosity that drove your passion. I think you seem to me you're just doing what you love doing, and it's taking you into all these different realms. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, actually, and people say I'm very diverse or something, but I think I'm very single-minded, very narrow in my interests. Just anything to do with the violin, I want to do it. And anything that doesn't have to do with the violin, forget about it.
Now, when most people say I'm interested in the violin, they're thinking they're doing scales, they just take it out of the case and they're in the practice room. But for you, that means more than that.
Absolutely. Well, I was lucky enough to be homeschooled starting at age 8, which was just for the practicality of schedule, to be able to do my academic work in fewer hours per day and do all the practicing I could possibly want, and then still have time to have a normal childhood, which worked out great. But what I didn't expect is that once I was no longer bound to that normal school schedule, not only did I get to do all the practicing with the violin in my hands that I could possibly want, but I had extra free time to explore music in a way that a lot of kids don't have the opportunity to do. So I could go to the library and just check out records of not only the interpretations of the concerto I was learning, but also chamber music and symphonies by that same composer, or just other composers I hadn't even heard of, but there was the record sitting there and I was going to see what it sounded like, reading the biography of the composer, learning about that concerto, and wait, it was written for this violinist. What was his life all about? And just starting to go deep in terms of what I was learning.
So can you think of an example of where you discovered something either about a musical figure, a violinist or a composer, that really impacted your performance?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many instances, like the Joachim Hungarian Concerto, for example. Joachim was Brahms's collaborator. We tend to think of the Brahms Concerto as being the logical piece that followed historically the Beethoven Concerto. But the missing link in between is actually the Joachim Concerto. The Joachim Concerto was inspired by the Beethoven Concerto. Brahms Concerto was inspired by the Joachim Concerto. And so it's, but that's just like esoteric. Well, how does it impact how I play that music? Well, reading about Joachim's musical personality, he was a conservative. He didn't believe in doing anything showy. Even if there were difficulties, you were supposed to transcend them and have everything be about the pure music. And so if you look at his concerto, which has lots of very difficult passages, which is called Hungarian style.
Yeah, you would think it would be really rhapsodic and go crazy.
Yeah, you'd think it was one of these schmaltzy, things full of flair, like if, Hubai had written it or something, one of these lighter things, virtuoso violin stuff on Hungarian airs. But no, he's taking this Hungarian music and elevating it to high art. And so you're supposed to play it very serioso the whole time. And by extension, then when you go and play the Brahms Concerto, you're supposed to play all of those difficult, athletic passages. Joachim clearly had stamina and he had large hands, and you can see from his own concerto what he was physically capable of. And the Brahms Concerto has that, but it's all supposed to be at the service of the musical ideas. And you're supposed to, if it's hard, that's just an unfortunate side effect that you have to deal with. And so it's those kinds of things.
So it's not about showing off, it's really about that musical line, that musical communication.
Absolutely. And, playing the Tchaikovsky Concerto, of course, you can hear in the music what the emotions are. But reading about his suicide attempt and his struggles with his homosexuality, and then how he was hanging out with a friend and cheered up, and the course of the composition of the concerto and how that all flowed, really provides, I think, just a level of inspiration that even if you can't relate to those exact biographical details in your own life, I'm a straight woman, what do I know about what Tchaikovsky went through? But each of us goes through, points in our life where we're full of angst and struggle, and we have to move past that, and then that feeling of catharsis. And so, you can definitely relate to that, and just as an actor, think about what these composers were living.
I've often said that to students, they'll say to me, like, oh, I don't want to know all this other information. It gets in the way. Like, I'm trying to memorize the piece. I don't want to be thinking about the composer's life. I don't want to be thinking about their emotional struggles. But there's another argument that it actually deepens your relationship to the piece. It makes it easier on stage to be connected and to actually do the things you need to do if the motivation is not, oh my gosh, I'm worried about this run, but oh my gosh, I want to show the joy that this does, or I want to show the the suffering that this illustrates.
Absolutely. And one of the things is, whether a composer is alive or dead, it's almost like a collaboration between the performer and the person who wrote the piece. And so you have to find that balance between being true to yourself and your own instincts and your own personality and your own taste, but also understanding the composer, and beyond the composer, what was the musical tradition of the time and place. I mean, a few generations ago, an artist might have played Brahms kind of like they played Mozart, kind of like they played Bach, and they sounded very personal, like themselves. Now we should keep that element of always sounding like ourselves and bringing out our individuality and our uniqueness in whatever we're playing, but we can go beyond that and at the same time be multilingual, as a Scottish fiddler friend of mine always says, and try to make music in a variety of languages. And it's about being historically informed, but not just as applies to early music, but as applies to anything. Music of the 1940s, we're going to add certain kinds of slides to the Barber violin concerto that we wouldn't add to the Shostakovich violin concerto, because slightly different time and place, and knowing that and what the music needs to be brought most fully to life. And so that's also a very important study. Another is the roots of where music might come from, if it has maybe a popular or traditional folk music element to it. Brooks' Scottish Fantasy was a revelation when I played it not too dissimilarly to how I played the Bruch G minor concerto. It was a work by a great German composer, and I was going to play it with a nice, rich German sound. And, I tried to have a little bit of that fairy tale, like, once upon a time quality to the introduction. But once I got to the lyrical sections, I played them like Bruch. And it was only after I started reading about the Spanish violinist Pablo de Sarasate that I realized that Sarasate had actually toured in Scotland and throughout Britain, but a lot in Scotland itself, that he knew fiddlers like Scott Skinner, that Sarasate himself had written a medley of Scottish airs for violin and orchestra, which is way earthier than what Bruch wrote. And Bruch, knowing that he was writing for Sarasate, even though Bruch himself had not yet been to Scotland, knew that he was writing for someone who knew Scottish music from having, set foot on the land and breathed the air and heard the fiddlers in the pubs, had fiddled himself. And so undoubtedly in the slow movement, it wasn't supposed to be German and square. You're not supposed to go da 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 da, but you're supposed to have that lilt, da 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 dun, da. Once you hear it that way, you can't go back.
Can't go back.
It has to be that way. That's the way that the original folk tune, and I hadn't yet been to Scotland, but I got together with a Scottish fiddler who knew this stuff, who actually helped me go to the library, find the 18th century tunes that Bruch knew from books and then used in his 19th century concerto. And, it's not that much work. It's just following your curiosity and, digging deeper and using this knowledge to then bring it back to how can I make this music even more meaningful. Well,
you're certainly, musically multilingual in the sense, because you've sort of done a lot of Scotch fiddling since then, right? And, and done a little bit of heavy metal performance in your day, but also classical and sort of
all the way to the medieval on my little Rebec.
Right. Well, and I saw you do an amazing early music performance, on a using a period bow and a Baroque violin. And do you find that, knowing and all these different styles and really studying all these styles, does that improve just traditional classical playing as well?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say like in a straight line, like, playing 17th century French music is going to make my performance of the Sibelius Concerto better, right? But I think anytime we're exploring, our creativity, involving our imagination and just searching for colors and phrases and whatever it is, it just means that we're going to think that much more, interestingly, whatever it is that we're thinking about. And so, and sometimes it's almost knowing what, a certain piece is not. And it's making sure that I've found this with cycles as well, doing stuff that's very, very narrow, like the 5 Mozart concertos in a single evening, the 24 Paganini caprices in a single evening. It's not about, oh look, I can play all 5 without keeling over. It's not that. It's about taking the audience on a journey through this particular set of the composer's output, which is an amazing experience. But it forces you as an interpreter to not only play Mozart in a way that's good Mozart and specifically Mozart and interesting Mozart, but you have to go one step further. How is Concerto Number 3 uniquely defined in contrast to Concerto Number 4? If all 5 are good Mozart, it's going to be one long evening.
Right.
So each one has to have something unique about it, something
So
individual
it forces
about
you
it.
to stretch your musical imagination, and
Yeah.
having that sort of wider stylistic palette to draw on, gives you sort of more colors in the box. More
Absolutely,
crayons to play
and
with.
thinking beyond your instrument. Mozart was influenced by his operatic tendencies, and so learning about the Mozart operas, watching them on video and live in person, and trying to bring that kind of a flavor. When I studied the Paganini concertos, I actually went to a vocal coach who specialized in the Italian bel canto, so that he could help me time the lines in a way that a singer would do from that era of Italy, which is what Paganini was immersed in. Never being afraid to ask questions. I think that's one of the biggest lessons I learned from being a homeschooler, is just seeking out experts and not being shy about it. When I was studying the Berg Concerto, I asked Pierre Boulez if he would spend a couple hours with me, and he said sure.
Wow.
I asked the last living private student of Schoenberg from the Vienna days, who had known all those guys, Richard Hoffman, over at Oberlin, drove down and hung out with him for a while. And it was amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing what will happen if you ask.
Absolutely.
So one critical question when it comes to sort of researching a piece is what editions you're going to use.
my gosh.
What is the piece, right? So I think most people go to the library or go online maybe, and they just download the first thing.
Freesheetmusic.com or some horrible thing.
Yeah. So what do you go to decide what you're going to use as far as the source for, say, one of these Mozart concertos or Bach?
I actually have a T-shirt that says "May the source be with you," and that.
I got to find one of those.
So really, you have to find out, is the manuscript the last word? And then maybe the editions were done after the guy died, he never checked them, they're full of misprints, or was the composer part of supervising the first edition and maybe even changed things between the time he scribbled out his manuscript and the time he's published the first edition? So maybe that's a more reliable last word of the composer. Or maybe there were lots of mistakes in the first edition, but they fixed everything when they made the second edition. Or maybe there are truths to all of them. The Berg Concerto is a great example of the fact that Berg left us a full orchestral score. He died. We thought the violin line was what it was in the orchestral score. Turns out that he had done a kind of sloppy job because he had done a very careful job with what's called the particel, where it wasn't a piano reduction, but he had squished what would be his orchestration as a first step into 2 staffs and very carefully, meticulously written out the violin line correctly. Then when he orchestrated, he intended to tell the publisher, take the violin line from the particel, the rest of the instruments from the full score, and then you'll have the correct
So it's just a
edition.
little sketch.
But instead he died. Nobody realized they should look at the particel, and for years we had all these misprints. So kind of an amazing story of such a major concerto being, and even the dedicatee in his first performances of it is playing these rampant wrong notes, because how could he know any better? So you have to rely on the work of musicologists to guide you about these things. A horrible example was the Bartók solo sonata. There was only one published edition. Menuhin had said, highest respect for Menuhin, of course, but he had, sometimes music is ahead of its time, right? So he had said that the quarter tones in the last movement were unplayable. Now these were not just quarter tones for the sake of certain harmonic ideas, but they actually were part of the very structure of the movement, in terms of the note, the pitches rising and falling as the music ebbed and flowed, and so on. Bartók reluctantly, what could he say?
Right.
Violinist says you can't play it, and you can't play it. So he let Menuhin's alternate version with only half steps stand. He approved it, but unfortunately what was published was just that version with no asterisks telling you that there had ever been anything different. It was a sort of, I was in an international competition when I was 16, and afterwards, one of the jurors came up to me and said he could tell by my bowing choices that I had been using Urtext editions for the Mozart sonata and the other works, and why had I not been doing the original notes for the Bartók solo sonata? And I said, well, I'm doing the notes that are in the music. What are you talking about? He said, well, let me give you a copy of the manuscript. Apparently the manuscript had been floating around from, Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox. And so that's how I discovered this stuff. And then I went to the university library that I was drawing upon their resources very heavily. A librarian who was always so generous and would help me with my obscure inquiries. And I said, can I read about this situation? What's going on here? So he found some musicological journals that had published articles about this issue and published lists of differences and published some of the excerpts that had those quarter tones and so forth. So, these are things that performers unfortunately, there's sometimes a divide where these articles exist in these publications, not in the types of journals that performers are reading, but in the musicology world, and you have to kind of seek them out. But anyways, so I started playing those notes, and then 3 competitions later, I'm at another international competition, and afterwards one of the jurors said, "You played so many wrong notes in the Bartok." And at which point I said, "Well, let me give you a copy of the manuscript." Oh, my goodness. Now, of course, there's a wonderful new edition that has the original notes and discusses all of it, has a lengthy foreword and so forth. But until that, we had to, hopefully hear from somebody that we should dig, and then we had to dig. And so some of it is luck coming across things, and other of it is being a bit of a detective.
No, I love what you're saying, because it's, there's not really that much difference between the academic research of music and the performance of music. I mean, in some ways, the ultimate sort of musicological article is a performance. I mean, you have to, make a commitment to an artistic vision. You have to make really complicated decisions, and there's all sorts of interpretive things. It's not just how does this line go sort of on an instinctual level, but I love how your
Absolutely.
research informs. You should be. I think you are a musicologist as much as I am, but I hope you don't find that an insult.
Oh, no, that's the highest compliment. Oh, my goodness. No, but I respect what you guys do so much, and it allows me to do what I do, because, I do have to practice all those notes. I don't have time to go and do as much of the primary research that's going to result in these secondary sources that are so useful. But, really it's a question of, today we have like a blessing and a curse. You can go online and you can find all this free stuff, but of what value is it? One of the saddest things is iTunes and now YouTube and all of these places where you can get recordings, and now streaming, of course, is the thing. And in all of these cases, you don't get the essay that would come with the physical recorded media, the LP and now the CD. You don't have the booklet. And not that everybody who had the booklet ever cracked open and read the booklet, but at least they had that option, they had that opportunity.
Right.
Now you have to separately go and try to find an essay on that concerto. And, that's a bit frustrating for me as a teacher. It's like, okay, well, have you read the basics about this piece? And often the answer is no, but of course they don't own a CD. So it's wonderful to be able to listen, and of course you should listen to many, many different performances, especially not only living people, but also dead people. And the good news is you can find all that on YouTube these days. But hopefully being able to, and I have to announce this on this video, because after you graduate, you suddenly lose all of your free stuff, your Naxos listening library, your Grove Music subscription. What are you going to do? Maybe you're in the early stages of your career, you can't afford the $250 a year or whatever it is to have a personal subscription to Grove, and that can be very disheartening, because suddenly, are you supposed to go like physically to the library every time?
Well, more now, right?
Depending on where you're living, maybe you don't have a great library in that town. What's going on? So you can actually join Early Music America, and as part of your membership, which is only in the 2 figures, you can have access to Grove Music and a lot of other resources. So that's an amazing chance. So always
especially for students or early professionals, often the subscription rates are even lower, right?
Absolutely. And you can still go to your public library and order interlibrary loans to get out-of-print stuff that is not on IMSLP yet. Actually, I have a podcast episode from my old Violin Adventures podcast, which was long before IMSLP, and it's titled something like How to Find Out-of-Print Sheet Music. And now, of course, a lot of the time you can go to IMSLP, but not everything is on there. Sometimes you still have to go the old-fashioned route and go on to WorldCat and then order it up through ILL.
Right.
And
I love how you don't take the first answer you get. You don't take the first hit on Google. You go a little bit deeper. You ask a question. When you find something, the question is, what is this? What value is it? And really it's the second hit and the third hit and the interlibrary loan. And
sometimes you have to track down the composer's great niece. You know what I mean? And then they'll be able to give you the answer. And it's always fun to talk to experts. I mean, the stories they have are so inspiring. You get out on stage to play that sonata, and you just have so much more enthusiasm for it somehow.
Right. And do you find that people are pretty friendly when you ask them questions just out of the blue?
I mean, every once in a while there's a crotchety person, and that you shouldn't be put off by that. That reflects on them, not you. But 99% of the time, people are not only willing but happy to talk to you about, their subject of interest or their own works. And today I was coaching a young woman who was playing a work by a living composer, and we realized we had a couple questions, and I said, well, did you email her yet? Well, it's a very famous composer, but yet most composers have a professorship, and most universities have a faculty page where you can actually have their email right
Public
there.
information.
And you can literally email a famous composer, not the dead ones. You can email Beethoven, so you better take advantage of this while these other ones are still alive. And you know what? I bet they'll email you back. The greatest thing in the world now is dissertations, because I found that the best way to find a dissertation, so you go on, WorldCat or whatever, you see what the dissertation is. Somebody's written their entire thesis on this one sonata that you're learning. And you're like, well, why should I analyze the whole thing? This guy already did it. I'll just read his paper. Great, shortcut. And he'll relate it to others of that guy's works. And, it's like he's already done it for you, handing it to you on a silver platter. Got to read the thesis.
Exactly.
It's only at the University of some obscure thing. So am I going to IOL it? Well, these days, no. I'm going to go on Facebook. I'm going to look this guy up. I'm going to send him a Facebook message.
Wow.
2 hours later, he has emailed me a PDF of his thesis, or she. And so this is brilliant. I mean, bravo to the 21st century technology.
So I hear rumor that you also do your own pre-concert talks. Is this true?
Well, it's so funny, because I used to, early in my teens, when such things started to exist, and I was touring around doing concerto performances, they would sometimes do the Meet the Artist bit, where, the host, who was maybe the local NPR guy, or maybe it was the conductor, maybe it was some local professor. So they would talk about the repertoire, and then they would bring me out for the last 10 minutes. They would interview me about my life for 5 minutes, and then take audience questions, which tended to be things like, how many hours a day do you practice? How old were you when you started playing the violin? The usual, which I'm always happy to answer for the 1,000th time, because I'm really flattered that people are interested, and it helps them get to know me and connect to the music better, but nothing off the beaten path. Then there was one time, I was 19, I was in Boise, Idaho, and I saw on my itinerary, okay, pre-concert talk at 6:30, concert at 7:30, so I'm ready to go, and I said, well, at what point in the talk am I, well, it starts at 6:30, yes, well, at what point am I going to do my little bit? No, here they are. So
it's all about you.
30 seconds before it began, they threw me into the room in front of 100, 150 people.
Wow.
And okay, have fun for the next 45 minutes. It was the Tchaikovsky concerto. I had not prepped. So I was just like, okay, if I was talking to a friend about the Tchaikovsky, what would I tell them? And I have more than 45 minutes worth of stuff to say. There's a lot to talk about. And then I very quickly, started doing these things either in collaboration. Now I always try to say, whether or not the host has already, talked about the piece themselves, I always try to at least bring my own personal touch to it, because the host is not going to know when did I first learn the concerto? What do I personally like about the concerto? What are my favorite spots? What does it feel like to play the concerto? What inspires me about it, and all of that. And knowing that, I think, helps give the audience an entry point to listening to it.
Absolutely. And it doesn't matter if it's a first-time listener at their very first concert, or the absolute expert who maybe knows more about the composer than the performer could ever know. They don't know what you think about the piece.
Exactly.
And so you can share your excitement and your joy.
And actually, that's such a true statement about interpretation. My aspiration when crafting an interpretation is always to have it be hopefully equally successful on two levels simultaneously. One would be for the sophisticated listener who is a classical connoisseur and knows every famous violinist interpretation of that piece, and all of that, and that what I'm doing holds water in terms of being, of something that makes sense on a deep level. And then, secondarily, but equally importantly, that what I'm doing appeals on a visceral level to a person who has no idea what the structure of the movement is, no idea what century the composer comes from or what country he hails from, just literally knows nothing and is only listening to the emotional content of the music, and are you reaching them? And I'm sure we've heard plenty of performers who do one or the other, but not both. And to do both is, I think, always the goal. And hopefully that sophisticated person is also feeling it, and hopefully that first-time listener can also somehow follow the thread because you're showing it, being their tour guide, even if they don't know what to label it. They don't know that this is the recapitulation, but they noticed when it happened.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for coming in today. I mean, just your passion, your excitement about music, your curiosity is a real inspiration, and I think people are going to love just hearing this podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much.